Good evening and welcome to the Bellingham City Council regular meeting. Today is Monday, September 27th, 2021. I'm going to call the meeting to order and begin with announcements and upcoming meetings. Bellingham City Council meets all requirements of the State of Washington Open Meetings Act. We have 3 upcoming public hearings. The first is on October 11th, 2021 at 7:00 p.m. There will be a public hearing to consider a draft ordinance amending Title VII of the Bellingham Municipal Code to revise setback requirements of beekeeping. The second is on October 11th, 2021 at 7:00 p.m. There will be a public hearing to consider a request from the Bellingham School District to amend the Capital Facilities and Utilities chapter of the 2016 Bellingham Comprehensive Plan to incorporate the district's new capital facility plan by reference. The third is that on October 11th, 2021 at 7:00 p.m., there will be a public hearing to consider the City of Bellingham's 2022 revenue forecast, including property tax levy. And with that, we will go to roll call, please.
Hannah Stone.
Here.
Dan Hamill.
Here.
Pinky Vargas.
Here.
Lisa Anderson.
Here.
Michael Lillequist.
Here.
Holly Huffman.
Here.
And I'm here also.
I'm so sorry, Jane.
I know, I'm starting to fade away.
We're practicing. No, I'm just kidding. We are all present and accounted for this evening. And so this evening as well, we actually have 3 public hearings. So the first is Agenda Bill 22599. So this is a public hearing on an emergency ordinance renewing and extending a moratorium on the processing of applications for detached single-family development in multifamily zones. And so for that first public hearing, as the public may already know, on March 9th, 2020, the City Council adopted an emergency 1-year moratorium ordinance, which was extended on March 8th, 2021, and again on August 30th, 2021. And that emergency moratorium prohibits the acceptance and or processing of any application for new single-family development in a multifamily zoned area. State law, RCW 36.70A.390, requires the City Council to hold a public hearing on an emergency ordinance within 60 days of passage. So at the conclusion of the public testimony this evening, City Council can take no action and keep the moratorium in place, or the City Council can vote to rescind or modify the moratorium. The moratorium ensures that land designated for multifamily development will be preserved and utilized at appropriate densities while new regulations are being considered. And so this evening, before opening the public hearing, I'll turn to Kurt Nabfeld with Planning and Community Development.
Good evening, Council, Mayor, and public. Kurt Nabfeld, Planning and Community Development Department. I always appreciate it when the summary statement essentially sums up what my presentation is going to be. It's really quite simple. Council has done this in the past. The reason behind this moratorium was to ensure that we didn't continue to lose more or have some of our lands underdeveloped, our residential multi-lands underdeveloped, while we undertook our residential multi-project. Just happens to be that you'll be holding the second public hearing tonight is on the proposed rules and regulations for our residential multi-project. So the council did act on August 30th and extend the emergency moratorium. This is a required public hearing that needs to take place. And at the conclusion of the public hearing, council does have the option to take no action, which essentially keeps the moratorium in place while we finish our work. You can rescind the moratorium or modify it. Staff suggests and recommends that you take no action and leave the moratorium in place for the the little bit longer while we can complete the residential multi-project. With that, if you have any questions, I'm happy to answer them.
Thank you very much. So first I was going to turn to public comment and see if we have any, the public hearing, and see if we have any speakers signed up to speak for this hearing, and then bring it back to council for a discussion at the close of hearing testimony.
Yes, looks like we have one person, Nabel. He is signed up as Nabel.
Okay. Okay, so I'm going to promote Nabel to panelists to move them over in order to receive testimony, and you'll have 3 minutes.
Thank you.
To speak. And so if you could state your name at the beginning, and
Yes.
then I'll start the timer for 3 minutes.
So I'm Nabil Kamel. I'm a professor of urban studies and planning at Western. I have a PhD from UCLA in planning, and I'm a professional practitioner with over 25 years of national and international experience. And I thank you for the opportunity to provide some remark on the residential multifamily project and the multifamily zones. I would like to start by thanking and applauding the city for putting housing affordability as a top priority, and I sense a genuine desire to improve housing conditions in Bellingham. It is in this spirit that I offer my remarks. First, I must say that I have tried to find out the methodology behind the selection of multifamily zones, but I was not successful. So I did a bit of reverse engineering and compared select characteristics of the residential areas designated as multifamily and the residential areas that were not included in the multifamily zones. I used publicly available data such as from the city of Bellingham, US Census, American Community Survey, and Zillow. And my preliminary findings suggest that compared to residential areas not zoned for multifamily, residential multifamily zones had lower median household income, lower level of educational attainment, higher percentage of unemployment, higher percentage of minority, non-white and Hispanic population, higher percentage of foreign-born. And at this point, the year of household moved in is not complete yet. It's inconclusive. So these are some of the socioeconomic indicators or component of what we call social vulnerability index. So what appears to be the case is that multifamily zones targeted areas with higher levels of social vulnerability. This means a higher risk of displacement for populations that are vulnerable. Related to that, when we match this information to changes in home sale prices and home values, data shows that between 2018 and 2020, property values in the residential areas in not zoned multifamily increased by close to 100% compared to less than 40% in multifamily zones. While this may appear as curbing skyrocketing home prices, it is not. I'll come to that later if I have time. But what it does is that the confinement of single family to specific privileged areas and the denial of equity acquisition actually represents a transfer of wealth from the socially vulnerable groups to those who need it the least. Numbers 3 and 4 add to that adding multifamilies in residential areas with higher percentage of vulnerable social groups means increased built impervious surfaces and less green coverage. Without mitigation measures, which I didn't see much of that in the multifamily zone plan, this directly translates into higher temperatures in these areas and what is known as the heat island effect. Associated with the loss of green cover and vegetation comes negative health effects such as asthma, other respiratory difficulties, heat strokes, again, in areas associated with higher vulnerability index. Having said that, my larger picture concluding remarks, if I have it in 30 seconds more, is that the idea that housing problem can be fixed just with housing supply solution rests on the assumption that this is a closed system. In other words, that supply can catch up with latent demand. That is not the case. Increased supply means more people moving in and prices matching the purchasing power of newcomers. And the evidence is clear that despite the rapid increase in housing built in the last 3 years, housing prices continue to increase and at a rate that exceeds state averages. Also, the idea that recognizing on one hand the failure of the market, while at the same time relying on the market to solve the housing conditions and the housing affordability seems to be a bit of a contradiction. What I would suggest, if Bellingham is serious about housing affordability, and I think the city and its residents are, the city should have a blanket moratorium on single family on all the city or nothing, no cherry picking, having non-market solutions that add to the provisions of housing affordability, and recognizing that housing affordability is not just a question of housing supply. Investments in local labor force, employment, living wage regulations, creative and non-market-based ownership arrangements, and a comprehensive approach to making Bellingham livable for everybody.
Thank you very much. Do we have anyone else signed up to speak this evening, Deputy Oakes, on this topic?
Not on this one.
Okay. Is there any of the attendees this evening wishing to speak to this public hearing related to the moratorium? If you are, you can raise your hand. Okay. Seeing no other attendees signed up to speak or with hands raised, I'll bring it back to council for discussion. Councilmember Knudsen.
Yes, Kurt, you mentioned a little bit longer. How much is a little bit longer to keep the moratorium going?
Well, the ordinance is drafted for 6 months. That's how long we can extend it. But the question really comes down to how much and how quickly council can get through the next public hearing and the next topic and come forward. Because the project does include amendments to our comprehensive plan. We can only do those amendments once a year. We generally do those at the end of the year. So our assumption and what our target is that we are shooting for is that we will have everything wrapped up within the next month or two and be able to take final action at the end of the year.
Thank you.
Other questions? Councilmember Lillquist.
When we come to the next item, Mr. Nabafel, I'd kind of like you to address some of the things I heard in the professor's comments, but I think it's better dealt with when we're talking about the next item.
Any other comments or questions related to this public hearing from council? Seeing none, the understanding is that if the council takes no action, the moratorium will remain in place. Otherwise, there could be action to modify or rescind the moratorium. But hearing no motions and seeing no action from council, it appears that we will leave the moratorium in place at this time in hopes that we will have regulations coming forward for consideration soon. Okay. Do you need anything further? Does staff need anything further at this time?
No, we do not. Thank you very much.
Okay. So with that, we will move to the second agenda item this evening, which is the second public hearing. So this public hearing is Agenda Bill 23111. So this is a public hearing to consider amendments to the comprehensive plan and municipal code for the residential multi-project. So beginning in 2019, the City Council directed staff to pursue strategies to facilitate intended densities in residential multi-zones. This project includes changes to the Bellingham Municipal Code and a number of neighborhood plans. Staff has completed the analysis of these zones and identified changes necessary to achieve intended densities and potentially increase the supply of small-scale housing types. The Planning Commission has completed their review process and in June voted 7-0 to recommend approval of the changes. And so this evening, I believe I'm first going to turn to Kathy Bell. Nope. Yes? Okay. I'm first gonna...
I'll start, Hannah.
Oh, you will? Okay. Perfect. So first we'll turn to Gregory Ockett with Planning and Community Development.
Good evening, Council. Thank you very much. With me tonight is Development Services Manager Kurt Nabafeld, Senior Planner Kathy Bell, and Senior GIS Analyst Extraordinaire Kate Newell. And Kate will be providing the bulk of the presentation. I just wanted to start out with a few brief remarks. So Kate, can you, there she is, right on cue. Next slide, please. So there are really three objectives when we started this project over a year ago. We in response to Council's direction to leave no stone unturned, to try and find ways to increase the supply of housing in Bellingham. We've identified a number of projects, broadening the application of the infill toolkit, for example, and the same with the ADU ordinance. And those are both underway. And this project, our intent was to achieve the intended densities in the RM zones. We were aware that some of our RM zones were being underbuilt. In other words, if an area was zoned for 10 units per acre, for example, and sometimes we were only getting 3 or 4. And we were counting on these areas. We are counting on these areas to accommodate a fair amount of growth, to accommodate our population growth. So one of the ways to ensure that we get the densities that we've planned for is to adopt minimum densities. And that's a big part of this project, requiring land to be developed at least to a minimum density. We also intend to implement comprehensive plan goals for housing, options, compact growth, and climate action, all of the benefits of infill development. And every time we take on a project like this, we try and simplify our multifaceted zoning code, and that's part of this project as well. Next slide, please. We have had quite a public input process. We've met with anyone and everyone who asked, and you can see the list here. I believe the Planning Commission had either 3 or 4 meetings on this topic before they completed their work and forwarded the recommendation to you. I just want to say in conclusion, our expectation is that council will hold the public hearing tonight and assign the matter to committee where we can get into the details, and there are a lot of details. If it would help us tremendously if at the conclusion of the hearing, you could identify the areas that you would like to spend some time on, the issues that you would like to have discussion on at the work session, or questions that you have at this point that we can make note of so that we can be prepared when we come back to the work session to make those as useful as possible. As Kurt mentioned, we need to get this work done before the end of the year. All of the comp plan amendments, the 2 that you've already processed, the rezone of the neighborhood parks, the stormwater plan, adding the stormwater plan to our comp plan, this project, and then the school district's capital plan, all of those need to be wrapped up by the end of the year. So it would help us tremendously if you can identify the issues and questions that you have tonight so that we can be prepared for the work session. And with that, I will turn it over to Kate to provide you with the bulk of the presentation tonight.
Thanks, Greg. As you might remember, we began this process with an exploration of our current conditions in residential multi-zones. If we look at the city in terms of land area within the city limits, about 18% of our land is zoned residential multi. Within those residential multi-zones, only about 34% of the current land area is being utilized as multifamily. This percentage does include missing middle forms such as single-family attached, townhome, and duplex. You can see about 22% of our land area in residential multi-zones is vacant, and about 25% is being utilized with single-family uses. This graphic shows the type of housing and land consumption that has occurred in residential multi-zones since our comp plan was adopted in 2016. The development trends show that single-family development in RM zones has consumed about 3 times the amount of land per unit as multifamily development. So taking this information into consideration, staff has proposed the following measures to work towards achieving intended densities in residential multi-zones, which also supports the comprehensive plan goals for increased housing options, compact growth, and supporting climate action. As mentioned earlier, these changes will also greatly simplify what is currently quite a complex zoning code in our residential multi-zones. So let's take a look at the 3 main components proposed in the project. We have the addition of allowing all infill housing forms in all RM zones, moving to a range zoning system for residential multi-zones, and establishing minimum densities in residential multi-zones. We do want to note that the density bonus component that we originally proposed was removed from the scope during our Planning Commission work sessions, as it was determined with further analysis that the bonus as originally scoped would only apply to a small area, and the area where it predominantly would apply was in an area which was identified in our 2019 equity audit as an area vulnerable to displacement. Our analysis on the density bonus option also revealed that a large number of our RM zones are already currently within location efficient areas and already designated as high, and will see incremental density increases through the range density proposal. And lastly, we do have quite a few density bonus provisions already available, and where those apply in residential multi-zones will remain. So for example, the bonus options available through our land division ordinance or the fee in lieu program, all of those will remain where they currently already apply. So the first proposal is to allow all infill housing toolkit forms in all residential multi-zones. Infill toolkit is currently allowed in RM zones with the exception that only the forms listed in green are allowed in our duplex zones. And those are the areas shown in green on the map here. So staff is proposing to allow all toolkit forms in the RM duplex zone. The RM duplex zone would be newly designated as RM transition zones to better reflect the forms proposed for these areas. And in addition, staff is proposing that no more than 4 attached units be allowed in a single building to maintain the intent of these zones. The next proposal is the range zoning concept. So this concept takes the comprehensive plan ranges shown on the left here and assigns them to residential multi-zones based on the densities listed in the zoning tables. In this example, the subarea's current density of 4,000 square feet per unit falls within the medium range. So under this proposal, development in this area could occur at a density between 3,600 square feet per unit and 7,200 square feet per unit. In addition to simplifying the existing code, which currently consists of about 24 different variations of density in these zones, the range system will allow for incremental increases in density in each range. Preliminary analysis shows that this would result in about a 20% increase in residential multi-unit capacity in these areas. And this is just another example of how we would implement the range zoning concept into our zoning tables. Here, the 43,000 square foot per unit density has been replaced with the medium designation, allowing development to occur at a density between 3,600 and 7,200 square feet per unit. And you can also see that the additional provisions and density bonuses that allow some areas to achieve higher densities has not been removed. So again, any existing density bonus will remain. The third component in this project is minimum densities. The previous 2 project components we just talked about really provide the opportunity for compact growth, but it's the application of minimum densities that really ensures those opportunities are utilized. Minimum densities allow us to achieve intended densities to support these goals. And just as a refresher, minimum densities establish the minimum number of units or type of development allowed on a property. They set the minimum level of development intensity on the land. We would like to note that staff has made a change to include a minimum for the low range. In our recent work sessions with the Planning Commission, they commented on the low category really not being appropriate at all for residential multi-areas. So based on those comments and the low capacity in these areas, we are recommending a minimum for the low zone. The residential density ranges in the land use chapter of the comp plan did not include a minimum for low. So staff is recommending adding a minimum for the RM low range, consistent with direction from Planning Commission. So here's an example of how minimum densities would be applied. In this example, we have a 1 acre site in a medium zone. Again, we only have maximums established in our zoning tables. We do not have a minimum requirement for a number of units. This example shows how a property in a residential multi-zone could be underdeveloped. With minimums established in this example of a 1 acre parcel in a medium zone, the developer would be required to build a minimum of 6 units. They can include a variety of housing types to meet this minimum density. Some of the concerns we heard regarding minimum densities during our Planning Commission work sessions were that we would only see apartment type development, especially on lands with environmental constraints. This here is an example of a project that's currently in application for 63 units on 11 acres. About half of the site is encumbered with critical areas and the associated setbacks. If this project were in a medium zone, the maximum potential units allowed would be 136 units. If we were to apply a minimum of 7,200 square feet per unit, the required minimum number of units would be 68 units. So you can see with just a mix of single family, townhome, and small house forms from the toolkit that this project is only five units shy of reaching the proposed minimum density, which could easily be achieved with the addition of a few triplexes or duplexes. In our analysis of current development, we found multiple examples of development that is currently occurring on land that has critical area and other encumbrances that would still be able to meet these proposed minimums with a variety of housing forms. So through this analysis and the research that we've done, we feel like utilizing the ranges and maintaining application of maximums and minimums is the appropriate option. Establishing these minimum densities really helps us ensure that we will see the densities intended for these zones. I'm going to hand it over to Kurt.
Great, thank you. So we wanted to talk a little bit about some specifics in the proposal. As some council members may recall, several years back, we adopted some changes to our commercial development standards. And one of the things that we did there is we tried to consolidate all of our commercial areas. We're taking that same concept and applying it to our multifamily development standards. So we're bringing all of the standards that deal with multifamily development that are throughout our code, we're bringing them into one single chapter. Hopefully that makes it easier to use and apply. Additionally, with those changes, we're recommending some reformatting that goes along with our table, or reformatting with tables, for enhanced readability. One of the things that our code does now is it's very verbose, and it has a lot of, Kate, can you go back to there we go. Our codes are filled with lots of words, and sometimes those sentences and words are hard to read. So with our changes in code, we are taking more of those standards and trying to put it into a table format, so it's easier to read. Obviously, with all of our codes, we have exceptions to them. One of the couple of the conceptions or exceptions deal with the limitations on single-family development. Currently, we're proposing that no more than 25% of the total units for a site may be developed with detached single-family homes, and that's the traditional detached single-family homes. That doesn't preclude infill toolkit forms, including small and smaller lot single-family. So those forms are still allowed. Because of this 25% number, as well as other factors associated specifically with like a site where you've got a substantial amount of critical areas, or where there's special circumstances applicable to the property, such as lot size or shape or topography, as something that's not the result of the owner's actions, we believe that there need to be exceptions to the minimum densities requirements. Also, if a site contains a historic resource that's listed as a national, state, or local landmark, we didn't want to make sure that we didn't lose a historic resource just in the name of trying to achieve density. So we've got some exceptions to their minimums there. And then also any application to replace or maintain an existing mobile home in a mobile home park. So obviously those are a form of housing that are needed in our community, and we felt that it was appropriate to continue to allow those forms. One additional comment on the limitations on single-family development. I think this was one of the key components that both the Planning Commission and our several of our community members had a lot of discussion on. One of the historically with Bellingham, you see these standard detached single-family homes, and you see walk-up apartments. We've heard it before, the missing middle. We don't have these missing middle forms. And so part of this project is to try to encourage housing diversity instead of those two standard forms, really trying to have more of the missing middle, the townhomes, the duplexes, the triplexes, all of those types of forms in our residential multi-zones. And so that's really, again, that housing diversity is really a key to the limitations on the standard single family development. Kate, I think that's it. Or next slide, I should say. So at this time, we are happy to answer any questions that City Council may have, or if you want to go straight into the public comment period, we'd be happy to do that as well. And just to reiterate, as Greg mentioned, as long as we're really hoping that Council will be able to provide us with some very specific areas and topics for our upcoming work sessions. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. So at this time, I was going to turn to Deputy Clerk Oakes and see if we have anyone signed up for this public hearing.
We do. We have 3 people.
Okay, great. So we will open the public hearing and we can start with the first speaker. I believe, yeah, they're highlighting council members, and then the speakers can be promoted to panelists so that they can share audio and video. So yeah, we can start with the first speaker.
First speaker is Ralph Black.
Did the technology work?
Did. You have joined us. So if you'll state your full name for the record, and then you'll have 3 minutes.
Great. Ralph Black, Alliance Properties, P.O. Box 28340, Bellingham, Washington. So thank you very much, Council, for an opportunity to speak tonight. As you know, I've spoken extensively on this particular topic, both the emergency moratorium and as well before Planning Commission and again tonight. So let me start with, first of all, within the ordinance as proposed by staff, the draft ordinance, we support the minimum density provision. We agree that a lot of these RM areas have been underutilized historically, and this underutilization that has happened has led us to where we are now at trying to achieve these densities. And we think that by use of the minimum density as provided within the ordinance, it not only will allow us to achieve our comprehensive goals in these areas now, but we can still also increase the densities in these areas because of the density bonuses. We have concerns on 2 main sections. One is under section 9, page 10 of the draft ordinance, which is the 25% rule, which Kurt has already spoken with about. Our position is that once the density is achieved in these areas, that it should be the housing provider's decision how this mix is. Because of the nature of the minimum density, there will be a mix. You will have to have traditional multi, you will have traditional detached single family, and you will have other housing forms to achieve these densities. There is no other choice because of the levels of densities. What we are saying is you should not restrict one housing form over another. Allow the housing provider to determine the housing form. And if it's single family detached that achieves the goals, that may well be the form. But we'd like the opportunity to speak in greater detail of this at the work sessions. The second is in section 12, page 19, which is the 50% rule having to do with multi-phase projects. So there is a provision within there that says if the project is multi-phased, no more than 50% of the 25% can be built at any given phase until such time as the multi is built to allow it. There's a whole series of issues with this. It's a lot more complex than I have time to get into in 3 minutes, but it's another that we wish to discuss at the committee level. Oh, that's my timer going off. At the committee level And we look forward to the opportunity to flesh it out. I think these two things will have some unintended consequences within the process, but we look forward to hopefully working through this and getting to the end of an ordinance that works for everybody. Thank you.
Time. Thank you so much. I appreciate it. Next speaker, please.
Bill Geyer.
Good evening, council members. This is Bill Geyer, Geyer & Associates, 1008 16th Street, Bellingham. I just have 3 points to add to tonight's discussion. For council members, Knutson and Lilliquist will certainly be aware because they've been here on council for the longest time. But the reason that much of the RM zone has been built out in the past with single family is since about 1990 forward, that was the only way to create small lot development. And I think it would, as a factual point, it would be helpful for staff to inform council as to those single family subdivisions that have been approved over that time period, because many of them have private covenants to them that restrict the lots only for single family use. That would be, I think, an important piece of information for you to know, because as this ordinance will probably have a 20, 30-year life, redevelopment may occur in some of those areas. So I think that issue at least should be understood and recognized. The other technical point I wanted to ask is that council may not be aware, but the consequence of moving in this direction will have a lot more infill toolkit development applications, and that has some good components to it. The infill toolkit permits, though, have a 2-year life, as do the design review has about a 2-year life. So plats have, as you may know, a 5-year life for preliminary plats. So I think it'd be good for the staff to inform the council as to how those elements overlap with each other and the practicality of how you go about constructing a plat when the buildings that you're going to build, their permits themselves may expire. So that's an issue to be looked at. And I guess the third and final thing I want to note, I support the density range concept. I applaud the staff on putting that flexibility in there. But one of the realities will be with the 25% limitation, there will be less acreage available for single family homes. And we understand the shift that's doing for the housing forms. But I would like to specifically request the council to assist in this effort for affordability and greater availability for land for housing, for the council to take the lead, and for those 13 or 14 locations in the city that are zoned RS 20,000, for the council to initiate an effort to change the zoning on those locations from 20,000 to a much more urban proper density, that it would be either 8,000 or 10,000, because if not, those areas will still remain locked up and undeveloped. But I thank you for your time tonight and look forward to the work sessions. Thank you.
Thank you, Bill. Next speaker, please.
Derek Long.
Good evening, Council. Derek Long here, 15-year resident of Bellingham. Speaking tonight on behalf of the Whatcom Housing Alliance. I serve on the steering committee and I also serve on the policy task force. In the packet are 2 letters from the Housing Alliance, one from May and one from September. The Housing Alliance, I think it's fair to say, has been excited about this multifamily project for a year or more, and because of its potential to add many more housing units, many more homes that we desperately need in the city of Bellingham. As many of you know, the Housing Alliance is made up of about 40 organizations. They come from private sector, real estate development, nonprofit, affordable housing developers and managers, environmental organizations, business and economic development organizations, public health and transit advocates, environmental advocate organizations. We believe more housing choices will help us be a more sustainable region by improving our environment, the social fabric, and the health of our people, and creating a stronger economy. And these benefits were spelled out in Kate Newell's slide on the benefits of compact development earlier in the presentation. We want to compliment city staff and the Planning Commission for a very thorough job up to this point on this project, and think it holds a lot of promise. a lot of promise for new capacity for new homes. And we like the range zoning concept, provides predictability and more flexibility and the opportunity to provide more homes for more residents. We also support the minimum densities work in the staff's recommendations and the Planning Commission's recommendations, and appreciate the way the assessment is done for calculating density based on gross land area. The infill toolkit option provides a lot more opportunity, we think, for owner occupancy opportunities. And we're excited to support city staff and planning commission's work on improving the infill toolkit in the future so we get more of those housing forms. I guess in the last statement, I'll say I'm excited that there's something of a deadline at the end of the year for this project because it's gone on for a long time. And COVID has really slowed down our work on, addressing development regulation improvement opportunities and zoning improvement opportunities. So I really encourage moving with haste on this so that we can get on to more work that we need to do to address the housing crisis. Thanks to City Council and staff again.
Thank you, Derek. Next speaker, please.
Dan Dunn.
Hello, everybody. My name is Dan Dunn. I'm the co-chair of the Building Industry Association of Whatcom County's Government Affairs Committee. And I would just like to start by saying thank you so much for the work that you guys have put into this so far. And we look forward to the sessions to work out some of the details here. I would echo a number of things that Ralph and Bill and Derek have talked about. First and foremost, that the BIAW definitely supports more housing in Bellingham. I think it's a clear need, and I think this is a good step in that direction. Some concerns that we have are looking at gross versus net area on land. That when you have an acre of land that's encumbered by critical areas, we would prefer that the area for density be looked at as the net area rather than the gross area. We would prefer that the single family homes, if we're allowed to build and achieve density with single family homes, that the owner of the land be allowed to do that. We'd prefer that multifamily and single family are decoupled from the sense that you can build one first and build multifamily first or build single family first, whichever way works out better for the folks who are developing that property. As Ralph pointed out, there's a lot of issues around single family and multifamily on the same plot. And several other issues we get into at a later time. But I look forward to this process. Thank you so much for letting us be involved. I know there's a lot of stakeholders, but we look forward to working with you guys in the future, and also look forward to working more on the infill toolkit and the ADU ordinances, which hopefully will come in the next couple of years. Thank you.
Thank you, Dan. Next speaker, please.
Mary Lou.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay. In Bellingham Municipal Code 20.04.030, number C, it says, in utilizing the comprehensive neighborhood plans as a basis of land use implementation, it is recognized that Bellingham is made of many unique and diverse areas, each with its own characteristics. And it is further recognized that to treat these areas uniformly on a citywide basis would not conserve or encourage those peculiarities which distinguish Bellingham from other communities. State law, RCW 43.21C, allows some categorical exemptions for infill development, but it states under B, it does not exempt government action related to development that is inconsistent with the applicable comprehensive plan, I feel like this is incompatible with comprehensive plan because it hasn't considered the neighborhood plans and keeping those neighborhoods characteristics unique. The comprehensive plan, neighborhood plans will undergo, at least in the Birchwood neighborhood, in 2025, revisions and gives the opportunity to make changes at that time. I don't feel like residents have been informed with this. I'm just now catching up with it myself. And I realize that's partly just because we're not often keeping track of all the council meetings and everything. But I do feel like there's other opportunities that haven't been looked at for providing higher densities in some areas that you should maybe consider. So I think this needs some re-examination. I feel like this is like, if you think of it of making Easter eggs, and you have all the different colors of the Easter eggs, and they're your neighborhood plans, and then you start adding colors to those eggs. If you add just a little bit of color, you can change the color and it still looks nice. But if you start adding every color, then all of those colors look the same. They all turn brown. And that's what's happening with this infill toolkit and the development, the way that it's going. And especially with regard to adding the transitional zone in there, which makes it easier for the affordable housing and the infill toolkit to be utilized across the board. You're making all these areas the same versus keeping their uniqueness. So that's my point. I don't support it.
Thank you, Mary Lou. Next speaker, please.
I don't have any more speakers.
I believe Professor Kamal wanted to speak on this issue as well.
Thank you.
And then we have a couple other hands raised.
Thank you. I'll just be very brief since I mentioned many of these things. One is, again, that the residential multi-map, as the last speaker mentioned also, does not pay sufficient attention to the characteristics of the neighborhoods. The plan as it consists now, if the goal is to increase affordability, then actually it doesn't seem that it's moving in this direction. And there are insufficient provisions, if any, to affordability provisions within the multifamily plan itself. Right, so there are no incentives, strong incentives for including housing affordability as a way to increase also or address the issue of increasing housing cost in Bellingham. The other thing that surprises me a little bit is that the residential multi, if I understood the presentation correctly and looking at the map, it shows only 25% of the land considered for residential multifamily, right? So the idea is that all the growth that is happening in the city is going to happen in this 25% of the land, right? At the expense of, again, these communities that, as the last speaker pointed out, have not been incorporated the neighborhood plans into the multifamily plan in a way that addresses the specific characteristic of every neighborhood. So that's my brief 2 cents. But again, the multifamily plan zone map really needs another look at it and consideration of whether we need a blanket moratorium on single family like many other cities did, or have a much more targeted approach that then addresses neighborhood by neighborhood the qualities of the multifamily that needs to be infilled into that. Thank you.
Thank you, Nabil. Next, Nabil. Deputy Clerk Oakes, I believe we have a couple of hands raised, and if there are other attendees who wish to speak on this topic for the public hearing, please raise your hand.
I don't see the raised hands.
Okay, so I see Paul Schisler.
Okay.
And then BIAWC, but no name specified.
I think they already spoke.
Paul, you should be able to unmute and share your video if you'd like.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
We can. You
Thank
have
you.
3 minutes.
Appreciate the opportunity to mention a couple things. I agree with much of what has been said this evening. I also would like to follow up with what Nabil has just pointed out. As many good changes as you may make in the Bellingham Municipal Code, I wonder if any of these will lead to homes that are more affordable than market price. And that's what we really need in the community. I think the numbers show that we have more market price homes than we have people who can afford them. And we have a large shortage of homes that are affordable to people who cannot afford market price homes. So while I'm not opposed to these RM project improvements to the code, if our concern is affordability, I'm afraid these changes are not helping, and they may be worsening the problem. If we use up more of our land for homes that are market price, we have less land available for homes that are better than market price. Still high quality, in my opinion, preferably owner occupied and permanently affordable homes that are well maintained, an asset to the neighborhood, and that can share equity or provide some wealth building potential for those of us who are less than medium income. Whatcom County is on board with trying to solve the housing affordability problem for people in the workforce who make 120% of the median income and below. So many of us in that category are priced out of what's affordable in the market. So we need homes that are better than market price, more affordable, permanently affordable, well-maintained. There's ways to do that. So as I say, I'm not opposed to these RM project changes, but I don't want us to kid ourselves that we're helping with affordability. I'm speaking only as myself. I'm a member of the Whatcom Housing Alliance Steering Committee. And full disclosure, I work for a number of organizations in the region who are dealing with affordable housing. And I'm an independent contractor freelancing and have been for over 25 years. Part of my work is housing affordability. It's complicated. It's hard to solve the problem. The problem's getting worse for most of us who are less than median income. So I'm not opposed to the RM project changes, but we have a long way to go. Thanks for the opportunity to comment.
Thank you, Paul. So the next speaker, I see a hand raised with BIAWC. I know that someone from the organization did speak, but I know that the organization is larger than one individual, so perhaps there's someone else wishing to speak. If you should be able to unmute and share your video if you wish at this time, and you would state your name, and then you'll have 3 minutes to speak.
Good evening. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Perfect. My name is Robert Lee. I'm the executive officer of the Building Industry Association of Whatcom County. I represent 380 member companies and over 7,000 employees. Thanks for the time to speak tonight. We really appreciate it. We've provided public testimony in that very thick packet that you all have. So I hope you had fun reading that. Our Government Affairs Committee, as Bill Geyer touched on this evening, would like to request that staff, if you could define the entitlement steps for projects in the RM zone with a particular focus on the time required for overlapping permits. For example, infill toolkit, residential design review, capital facilities project, and the building permit application. If we could see a time frame for each and how it consumes, the up to 5 years of the preliminary plat award, we think that would be very valuable as we move forward with these changes in the zone. Thank you again for your time tonight. If you have any questions or need clarification of the things that we've submitted, please don't hesitate to reach out to us. Thank you again.
Thank you, Robert. Do we have anyone else wishing to speak on this topic this evening for this public hearing? If any attendees are wishing to speak, you can raise your hand at this time. do not see any other hands raised. I believe that the notices we received from people wishing to speak have had the opportunity. So with that, I will close the public hearing and bring it back to council for discussion. And prior to that, I guess, I don't know if there's any additional comment from staff. I know the staff presentation was prior to the hearing. So if council members have questions or comments. Councilmember Hamel and then Lillquist.
Thank you, Council President Stone. I just have some staff requested some feedback from council, and I wanted to provide areas where I want a little more clarification. One of the speakers brought up gross versus net. I think that needs better definition. I want to understand the 22% vacant lands, and if those are encumbered, if they're critical areas, or what is the potential for development within those areas. Also, I want to understand the interplay between the urban village concept and this RM zoning that we're talking about. And I am a proponent of increasing missing middle. I think those numbers are way too low. And I want to make sure that it's done correctly. So those are my comments here tonight.
Thank you, Councilmember Hamel. Councilmember Lillquist.
Thank you. I'm going to do what Dan did, sort of the things I would like for us to visit when this is referred to committee. Mr. Lee, and I think it was Mr. Geyer, referred to overlapping permit durations. If there's an issue there, I'd like the staff to take a look at that. I think it'd be important to clarify for the public maybe what this isn't. I think there was an impression that we were changing zoning, that we are either adding or imposing or expanding where RM zones are. My understanding is we're changing no boundaries whatsoever. And I think most of these zones are long-standing, decades and decades old in some cases. So, and I think some clarification there on what this isn't doing is important. It was a long packet. I didn't understand it all yet. Well, my question has to do with, I'm a big fan of minimum densities. I try to push minimum densities into our waterfront plan. I try to push it into the Fairhaven plan where I live. Minimum densities are really simple in doing what they do. And I think a couple of people commented on how they favor them. That the minimum densities seem to be doing a lot of the work. I like the idea of range zoning too. Again, it's a range zoning for the densities. Again, range density is a pretty simple concept, easy to apply. And then there are the other mechanisms that have to do with phasing or a housing type, and those are more complicated. And what I would like the staff to be able to answer is, if we just change the density numbers, what do we not accomplish? What is the additional benefit of what seems like most of the complicated factors? Why go through all that extra work? What is the problem we're trying to solve that a more simple approach kind of leaves undone? Like, what is left undone that needs to be added to it? So if I could understand that, I would appreciate that. Also on the range density, I didn't understand the range density for the low because the high and the low were the exact same number. I assume it must be average density or something, because no one can make every single lot exactly 7,201 square feet. So that was just like, I didn't quite understand that. I think that's probably enough indication of the sort of things that I want to talk about when we refer this committee. I'm generally in support of this, and I would like to get it done before the end of the year, and I think we can.
Councilmember Anderson.
Thank you. I'm really happy I had 4 years on the Planning Commission. And then again, when I decided to take another run at this and started getting into the really little details, I realized this would go to committee. And I probably didn't have to get up at 4 this morning to read it again. But looking at a higher level at this point, and I'll get into the more nitpicky stuff in the work sessions, I would like to know if the example of the Roosevelt area, where we weren't necessarily making a change because of the realization of the potential of displacement due to increased development. Are there other areas that perhaps could be at risk? I know you've identified one, but I'm concerned about other areas that, like in Birchwood, some of the transitional areas. Could we potentially have unintended consequences with displacement of more affordable housing at this point? The other thing, is there a way that we can get creative to really incentivize affordable home ownership with some of this development? So if we were allowing a certain amount of infill toolkit and single family housing, as long as, a percentage be built at the beginning and then multifamily later, perhaps if that was the direction that a developer went, is there a margin in between where we could incentivize with density bonus an additional percentage of infill toolkit development, providing that it was listed at a certain affordable rate? I'm just encouraging the planning department to take a different lens and look at how can we incentivize without necessarily a mandate, because I don't think legislation lets us do that yet. But if we can think outside the box and come up with a sweet spot where we can partner and incentivize to create more affordable home ownership, where the developer could still turn a profit, perhaps not market rate, but we can increase some of that affordable home ownership, that would be wonderful. My other concern too, though, is I would like more information on how this scenario would not happen, where a developer does build out their 25% of single family and then they sell off to another developer what should be multifamily, and then that doesn't get built. So I want to make sure that we are getting the density needed. And I know that there's a possibility of development agreements, but I would like more information on what that would look like, so we have some level of assurances that we will get the appropriate build out. But I'll stop for a moment. I know there's another one, but I have to remember it.
Councilmember Huffman.
Thank you. So I have kind of a beginner level question I'd like to have addressed when we talk in committee. Although we're not changing the percentage of residential multi-zoning that we currently have in the city. I'm really interested in hearing about how we got to have 8% or 18% residential multi in the city versus 44% single family, how that's changed over time, how those areas became designated as residential multi. I think that the history of that, a short history of that, would be really helpful.
Councilmember Anderson.
Thank you. Now I remember. So I know the UGA area is not something that we at this point have the full determination on zoning, because that kind of falls, I believe, to county. But are we looking at those margin in those areas, and not necessarily part of this plan, but are we working with the county to make sure that someday, at some point when we do bring in part of the UGA, that it is zoned in a way that is going to be beneficial for Bellingham, where we could have zoning already predetermined that's going to allow the development of mobile home parks and just kind of better planned development. It's very difficult to bring something in because there's a lot of pressure to bring in some of the UGAs for single family housing. And I have no interest in bringing in the UGA unless we have kind of some of the tools that we need for industrial, for mobile home parks, for the multifamily, for the single family. So is there any work or collaboration? And that could be another discussion at another point. But since we are talking about increasing our housing stock and density and in multifamily. I'm wondering if that pre-work is happening at all at the county.
Other feedback from council members? Councilmember Hamel?
Yeah, I think CM Anderson is correct here. One of my other notes here is to understand the annexation phasing plan and how that interplays with RM development. Also, urban levels of service provision when it comes to public safety in particular, and how that will work. We're talking about further densities as we expand our UGA.
Councilmember Vargas?
Thank you. Some of my questions have already been answered, but overall, we are in dire need of simplifying our zoning and increasing density. So minimum density, I'm definitely in support of. Some of the things have already been asked for, but one of the things that has come up over and over again is permit timelines and crossovers, and that not always balancing out. I think Councilmember Lillquist mentioned that. So if that is something that we could address, and looking into a little bit more of the 25% and understanding what consequences are on both sides. So those are the my interests that have not been addressed so far.
Councilmember Lillquist?
Not to cut off conversation, but I move that we refer this to the earliest convenience committee for planning.
Second.
Motion's been made by Councilmember Lillquist and a second by Councilmember Knudsen to move these items to a work session before the planning and community development. Actually, now it's planning. Community economic development is a separate committee. So before the planning committee. And further discussion, Councilmember Anderson.
Thank you. And good timing. I really appreciated this packet. So having read a lot of planning revisions over years, I just see a vast improvement in the presentation, how things are laid out. I opened up some of my past planning packets on some of our urban work and our comprehensive plan. And I just wanted to commend staff that it just seems to get better every time. It's been a while since we've worked on something of this depth. And I do believe with, as Councilmember Lillquist had stated, I do believe we can get through this by the end of the year because this is really well done. A lot of good work has already been accomplished. I think we'll have some opinions and tweaks, but I just wanted to commend staff that you've given us, I feel, a very good start, a good running start on this revision. So kudos to staff for all the work that they've done putting this together.
Thank you, Councilmember Anderson. Yes, I would echo that. And my sigh of relief in realizing that this was going to committee for work session, which was my hope, and not, as it states on the cover page, pass ordinance. And so I too this weekend was trying to digest everything more quickly than I would have liked. So this is a big, sigh of relief, a lot of work to be done, and hopeful as well that this can be completed before the end of the year. But as Councilmember Anderson just highlighted, a great start. And thank you very much to the hard work and outreach from staff and at all levels. I know it's a group effort, so thank you very much. So we have a motion before us to move this to the planning committee that was brought forward by Councilmember Lillquist and seconded by Councilmember Knudsen. If there's no further discussion, all those in favor will say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed or abstentions? Seeing none, that passes 7-0. Okay. Anything further from staff on this item? No. Okay. Thank you very much. So next, this evening is the third public hearing that we have before us tonight. So this is Agenda Bill 23112. This is a public hearing to consider amendments to Bellingham Municipal Code, Chapter 20.15, temporary shelters for people experiencing homelessness. So the proposed revisions would allow for up to 3 one-year renewals beyond the currently allowed maximum of 2 years at any one shelter site. The ordinance establishes a process and criteria to evaluate renewal requests. Renewals would be evaluated based on proposed criteria contained in the ordinance. The Planning Commission has completed their review and in June voted 6-0 to recommend approval of the proposed amendments. And for this, I see lots of familiar faces. Who wants to go first? Should I send it to Kurt? Okay, so I'm going to send it to Kurt Navajo first with Planning and Community Development.
Great. Thank you very much. As noted, the proposed code revisions tonight will allow for up to 3 one-year renewals with a maximum time frame of 5 years for temporary tiny house encampments. As you may recall, the City Council adopted the temporary encampment regulations back in 2019. And since then, we've realized that the encampments require a substantial upfront or a substantial amount of upfront costs to the city as well as the organizations just to prepare the site and provide utilities to the encampment. Allowing a longer term helps the city provide a more cost-efficient service per resident served. And in order to ensure this housing form is a step in the way to more permanent options, any renewal should be measured in a placement of encampment residents, as well as compliance with established permit conditions. The City of Seattle adopted a 40% annual placement requirement of encampment residents into permanent housing as a requirement for a longer term. Staff does not suggest adopting a specific percentage, but believes utilizing that to help measure the success of these as the facilities, as the terms are extended is important. Additionally, any encampment on city-owned or leased land or receiving funding from the city should ensure that the client data is entered into the homeless management intake system. This will also help staff analyze the success of the program and when determining whether or not to renew the permit. As council members probably know, we have 3 temporary tiny encampment operations currently in the city of Bellingham. Those encampments would be able to apply for these extensions if needed. Also, when adopting our regulations, it's important to make sure that we go back and review what's working and what isn't working. Staff believe that the proposed changes will allow the organizations, including the city, the ability to recover the upfront costs more effectively while continuing to help folks transition to the more permanent housing solutions. As such, both the Planning Commission and staff recommend approval of the proposed changes before you. And joining me tonight is Tara Sundin, the Economic and Community Development Manager, to answer any questions about our funding mechanisms from that side of things. With that, both Tara and I are available for questions if you have any.
Thank you very much. So first we will open the public hearing and take public hearing testimony and then come back to council for follow-up discussion. And so for this item related to the amendments for temporary shelters, and those extensions, we'll turn to Deputy Clerk Oakes for the speakers we have signed up.
Melissa Bird is the first speaker.
Great.
Hello, thank you all for letting me speak this evening. My name is Melissa Bird, and I am one of the founders and current president of Road to Home. We're currently building Garden View Village, the tiny home village that will be located at the old Clean Green site, along with the Low Income Housing Institute and the support of the city of Bellingham. We look forward to opening soon, but we are already months into our current permit and no one has moved in yet. I'm speaking to encourage you to vote yes on this amendment of the ordinance that allows the tiny home villages to extend past the initial 2 years. The amount of infrastructure that had to be completed on site prior to us being able to start building these homes was vast. Electricity, water hookups, and sewer were installed on the site. Our volunteers are working tirelessly on weekends, on their days off, in the rain, to get these houses up and ready. And we would like to see people to be allowed to stay on this site longer than a year and a half. While the houses are intended to be easy to move, it doesn't come without costs and risks. Some of the units we received from 360 Modular had to be repaired because of damage caused by delivery. There's also a large cost burden in delivering the homes from one site to another. I hope you will consider the benefits of this amendment, which include protecting the city's investments, allowing nonprofits to utilize their resources more appropriately, and encouraging the neighborhoods to comment when renewals are submitted. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, Melissa. Next speaker, please.
I have no more speakers.
Are there any attendees present this evening wishing to speak on this topic? If so, you can raise your hand with the raise hand feature. Seeing none, we'll bring it back to council for discussion. Okay, so first, Councilmember Knudsen.
I will move approval.
Second.
So motion's been made by Councilmember Knudsen and a second by Councilmember Huffman. Let's see, Councilmember Anderson.
Thank you. I do support this full realization that it is expensive and time consuming to find another location and set it up. My only question is to ensure that they're dispersed around the city in a way that one neighborhood is not disproportionately hosting tiny homes in their neighborhood. We have 2 in Puget. And not that I would want one or the other to be moved, but I just wanted to know from city if there was any consideration. Should somehow a third permit come up, is there a limitation on how many can be within a particular neighborhood? Has any thought gone into that?
Thank you for the question. Currently, there is no specific code that limits where they're at. Obviously, when the city is participating, we look into that, we evaluate that. We too believe that it should be dispersed. But as you may know, trying to find a location is very, very challenging, especially when we don't have other agencies or nonprofits that are stepping up to help it. So finding the right location in the specific locations is pretty limited, and it's hard when we're looking at just city-owned facilities. So if we can get more folks out there that can help us utilizing their land, that would definitely help into the dispersal.
I just wanted to add to that. Thank you, Kurt. I just hope that when we're talking about disbursement, we're looking at all of our programs together and not just looking at one type of homeless facility. So while Puget does have 2 right now, there's other neighborhoods that have a lot more homeless services. So I just want you to keep that in mind, that there's lots of different forms. And again, this will go back to impact as well as the success of these programs moving people into affordable housing and out of the villages.
Thank you for that, Tara. Councilmember Lillquist.
Thank you. I fully support this. These are, I believe these are permitted and supervised facilities. And they have to meet certain operating standards and safety protocols for the residents. They're good programs, and I think extending their duration is a fine idea. The problem is not the ordinance. The ordinance is fine. The ordinance is good. The problem is what Mr. Nabafeld referred to. Finding a place for someone to even apply for a permit is our difficulty. Let's be honest. If the city itself hadn't loaned properties for tiny home villages, there would be none, zero. That's our real problem. And my concern is that even if you have the best behaved, most successful tiny home project that runs out its term, then what if we still don't have more locations? I'd rather we didn't have to depend upon finding more and more locations for shelters and interim housing. I'm hoping we make progress instead on finding better ways to transition people into permanent housing, that we make up for that shortfall in what's available. My goal is not to have more and better shelter programs, but to have fewer people who need the shelter programs. And that reduces the size of the facilities we do need to have. So instead of having a 250 bed facility, because we have 250 homeless people, we can have a 100 bed facility because that's the size of our problem. So this ordinance is great, but we have another problem, and that problem cannot be solved inside this ordinance. It has to be solved outside that, in the community, with us and with members of the public helping us.
Councilmember Anderson.
Thank you. I have two questions, but kind of the same organization. So Homes Now has a location down in Fairhaven, and over the last couple of years, I think there was some commitments made to the neighborhood that it was going to only be extended for so long. And if we go to an extension of 3 additional 1 years, will that apply to them? Personally, I do hope so, because I don't know when their current permit would expire, but winter is coming, and I would really hate to think they would have to be on the move at this point. And then, was there an additional location? At one point, there was conversations, I believe, that something would be coming down on port property, and I haven't heard if that ever manifested. So I'm kind of curious if there is a third, or at this point, a 4th tiny home village that is going to be sited in Bellingham. An update on that would be useful.
I can respond. The Homes Now facility, Unity Village down in Fairhaven, if this new rule passes, they would be subject to it and could apply for an extension. With that in mind, we did make some commitments to the neighborhoods, but I think that was under a set of rules. And as we've mentioned, once we apply rules, those rules aren't forever. And it's, I think planners, we consider ourselves agents of change. That's the one thing that is constant in our world is change. Things are continually changing, and we have to have the appropriate rules to reflect that. So again, we try to find as many places as we can for this. But I think what we have found is when some of these villages go into the neighborhoods, there's a lot of fear about the unknown of what's happening right away. But once they get there and they see how well some of these are operating, those fears are alleviated. They don't come to realization. So as we've had, Sunnyland neighbors that were very outspoken at the permitting process at that point. When we had our Garden View neighborhood meeting, some of them came forward and said how much they supported it. So we definitely are. I just think that we're learning, and we need to have the appropriate rules and regulations in place, and they may need to change. One other thing that I do want to make sure everyone is aware of is that we do have a project down in Fairhaven associated with the treatment plant that is likely to have relocation. So we continue to try and find additional opportunities and additional sites, and we'll continue to do that in the future.
Councilmember Hamel.
Yeah, I just want to address the various neighborhoods being hosting or being impacted or whatever the perspective is. I just want to, I just did a quick count here for Ward 3, which is the ward that I was elected out of. We have 22 North, Francis Place, Kateri Court, Washington Grocery Building, Base Camp, Eleanor Apartments, Pioneer Human Services, Sun Community Services, Dorothy Place, YWCA, Sunnyland hosted the Tiny Home Village at Whatcom, and we have Laurel and Forest. There's a new development that's going in there that's being built, and then Millworks. That's off the top of my head within the last like 45 seconds. I'm sure I'm missing some, and there are also scattered site apartments that are basically invisible to most community members because they're not a facility. So these things are spread out and they are being dispersed throughout the community. Barclay is even going to be a site for affordable housing. So I just wanted to be clear that yes, indeed, we are dispersed throughout the community. We take that seriously. Former planning Director Sepler made it clear that he didn't want any one particular neighborhood to have to I shouldn't say to have to, but to host a tiny home village, that it should be moved throughout Bellingham. And I hope that the current members of planning are following that kind of thought process. Thanks.
Councilmember Huffman.
Thank you. So I'm enthusiastically supporting the motion and would like to point out the shift in mentality in our community from the time that I was at one of those Sunnyland meetings and the neighbors had a lot of trepidation, and now we haven't seen a single person voice their opposition to this change to extend this. And so I just want to commend the community for making this change in mentality. But one question that I did have about data collection, which I think is incredibly important if we want to analyze our needs in our community, is the requirement, I think, did you say it's just for organizations receiving city funds? And does that mean checks, or does that also mean in-kind services?
The way the ordinance is drafted is it's if those specific requirements apply when the encampment is located on city-owned land or that receive funding from the city. I think our initial intent was dollars and funding as well as services. And Tara, I'm not sure if you've got more to add on that.
No, that's right. The Homes Now villages are on city property, but they also included investments that the city made. So both of those situations.
Any other council members have comments related to this item? We do have a motion before us that was made by Councilmember Knudsen and a second by Councilmember Huffman, which is to pass the ordinance as presented in our packet. Any further discussion? Okay. Seeing none at this time, all in favor will say aye.
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 Any opposed or abstentions? Okay, seeing none, that passes 7-0. Anything further needed from staff at this time? No. Okay.
No, thank you very much.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right. So maybe we just finished committee of the whole, but we haven't. We just finished the public hearings. So next on our agenda this evening is the mayor's report. Mayor Fleetwood.
Thank you. Good evening, council. That was a good set of public hearings. Nice comment and back and forth. I'll look forward to work sessions on these items. Just a few appointments. First off, this is just a reappointment as information only. I'm appointing Raymond Deliker to the Parks and Recreation Advisory Board. I'm also going to be appointing, this is also information only, appointing Sunita Eisenberg and Christopher Pasquale to the Community Development Advisory Board. As I said, that's information only. And also I'm going to be, and this requires council approval, I'm reappointing Ryan Van Straten to the Design Review Board.
Move approval.
Second.
Yeah. Motion's been made by Councilmember Knutson and a second by Councilmember Hamel. Any discussion? Seeing none, all in favor will say aye.
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 Any opposed? Or abstentions? Seeing none, that passes 7-0.
Great. Thank you very much. Also, this just in, asked to report this out from our Parks Department, Nicole Oliver. Shuckson Meadows Park has a brand new playground and is open now, located next to Shuckson Middle School on Maplewood in the Birchwood neighborhood. Come check out Bellingham's first crab trap play structure. So that's good news. Also, just an announcement relating to Indigenous Peoples Day, also known as Coast Salish Day. City of Bellingham recognizing Monday, October 11th as Coast Salish Day, also widely recognized as Indigenous Peoples Day. The city, Western Washington University, and other local education organizations are partnering with the Lactamish Foundation and the Swinomish Indian Tribal Community Education Department to host an Indigenous Peoples Day virtual community event. The event will feature a visual presentation from photographer and speaker Matika Wilbur, who is from the Swinomish and Tulalip tribes, as well as performances by the Black Hawk Singers and other presentations. It's scheduled for 11 a.m. to 1 p.m. Monday, October 11th, which of course is Council Day. We will work with Council President Stone to help schedule council committee meetings that day in a way that allow us the opportunity to attend this event. Live stream details and publicity about this event will be circulated by the city and all the partner organizations this week. Also, during old new business this afternoon, Councilmember Pinky Vargas requested information about the new Northwest Youth Services PAD project, which is proposed on 36th Street. And Kurt Naberfeld from Planning Development Services, our manager there, is joining us tonight for an update in response to that. So I'll hand it over to Kurt.
Great. Thank you, Mayor. So we just wanted to provide a quick update on the Northwest Youth Services PAD application. They submitted an application for a smaller interim housing unit. The interim housing regulations were reviewed and adopted by City Council in early 2020. In those code provisions, you created a system of review associated with these forms of housing. And essentially, the small facilities, as the PAD was considered through a type 1 process. Northwest Youth Services submitted an application. The city reviewed all of the applicable facts associated with that. The type 1 review process does not require a public comment period. However, we did receive public comment during that time frame that we were evaluating the application. We responded to those, and a permit was issued last Friday for the facility. I think, as Councilmember Vargas mentioned this morning, there may be some misunderstanding or miscommunication or maybe some misuse of facts. One of the things that did come out into the public comment period was the number of police calls to the current facility down on North State Street. I think it's very important to notice that we did contact both our police department, and we also contacted Northwest Youth Services to learn more about those calls. And the vast majority of those calls were a report of juvenile runaways. Now, Northwest Youth Services is required to report them as runaways when they do not check in or they do not come back. So the vast majority of the calls that were received, there were a number of them, were really about the youth not returning to the facility. We looked at that data and determined that a youth not coming back to the facility is not increasing or doing detrimental harm to the neighborhood. So there's we felt there was a mischaracterization of utilizing the number of calls versus the actual impact that's associated with those calls. I think that if you have additional questions about that, we're happy to answer those. Tara Sundin is also here with me. She represents the funding side of that, while I represent the regulatory side of the project.
Councilmember Lilliquist.
Thank you, Kurt, for that information. I think one of the things that was clear that people didn't quite understand when we started getting emails is that this wasn't a city council decision. City council is never involved in permit review and permit issuance. So I didn't know that the Northwest Youth Services had bought this particular location and what the application was. So I followed it like everyone else. But what I learned most recently is apparently Northwest Youth Services had tried twice before to purchase property and relocate their pad, and those applications or those attempts had been turned down or rejected, or Northwest Youth Services walked away from it. Was the city involved in any of those other two attempts? Because I hadn't heard about those either.
The Northwest Youth Services has kept us somewhat informed because as a funder, we need to look at it from a NEPA, national SEPA NEPA perspective. But we did learn that too, and I think it was in the case of the homeowners decided not to sell it to Northwest Youth Services. It wasn't a matter of them backing out. No permitting started. I don't believe any permitting started on those two. Just started on this house. And by the way, they have not acquired it. They're planned to close on it on the 30th of this month.
Councilmember Anderson.
Thank you. When we passed this, the whole intention was to help lower the barrier to be able to site these services throughout the community. And I still believe in that process and that, because we need to expand our shelter for our more vulnerable populations. My concern when we passed that is I wasn't too sure how neighborhood covenants might play as a way to, but citing and covenants came out in the letters. As Councilmember Lilliquist stated, we really didn't have anything to do with the say in where this gets cited, nor do I think we have necessarily a good mechanism to prevent it. Not suggesting we would, but since covenants has come up quite a bit in the emails, I was wondering, and I always thought covenants was one of those barriers we weren't able to penetrate with changing of zoning. So I'm kind of wondering if you could speak to that in the greater picture, not just necessarily the site, but how could covenants play in perhaps preventing it, if that is at all legally possible, or does covenants not matter in a situation like this when a new owner purchases and decides to use it in this capacity?
I think, well, I'll start with this and then I'll turn it over to our legal department, James Erb, to maybe add to it. But essentially, when it comes down to private covenants, the city is not authorized, nor do we have the authority to enforce private covenants. Those are covenants that are between the individual property owners, and the city does not have the ability to enforce those. James, I'm not sure if you have more to add on that.
I would just echo what Kurt said, which is that the private covenants are, they are exactly that. They are private. The city has no enforcement role when it comes to private covenants. We do not interpret private covenants, nor do we condition permits or consider private covenants as part of our permit review processes. So while many of the neighboring property owners noted that the private covenants may prohibit this type of use in that particular neighborhood, that is something that they would have to pursue separately other than our permit review process.
Thank you, Mr. I saw Councilmember Anderson's hand up and down, but now it's down.
I was just going to ask, as far as just clarifying that it is up to the neighborhood. If they should choose legal recourse, it's up to them, and the city wouldn't have any involvement. I just wanted to make sure that we weren't, since we financially assist this organization, if there's any liability that would come back to us, I would assume no.
Yeah, that's correct. So the enforcement of those covenants is up to the neighboring property owners and other property owners that are bound by them. And to date, I've seen public comments referencing the covenants. I've never even had the opportunity to personally review any of the covenants. But if any of the property owners choose to do that, that's entirely up to them.
Councilmember Lillquist?
Do we have any other facilities like this located in a residential area in Bellingham? And I just have to make an observation that we just kind of celebrated and passed an ordinance that has to do with tiny home villages, a kind of interim housing that neighborhoods were concerned about. And then when they got them, most of their concerns went away. I'm wondering if we have examples like that, or if this facility may one day be an example of something that people were concerned about until they actually experienced it and saw that it could be well run. Are there any facilities other than the pad, which is not really the current location downtown, which is not in a primarily residential zone? Do we have any similar facilities? I think certain kinds of rehab houses, not for youth, are outright permitted by state law. Is that an example that we can point to?
We do have examples. If Sammy is on here, she'd know all the names of them. I know that there are some examples in the Columbia neighborhood, the Leonard Streets neighborhood. The Opportunity Council is about ready to open Recovery House, which is in the Leonard Streets neighborhood. Sun Community Services is in our neighborhoods. And so a lot of times they just end up fitting in with the neighborhood. I could get you a list if I provided a little bit more time. Is that good enough answer for you right now, Michael, or do you want the?
Well, it's not so much that I need it, rather than like maybe we all, and I mean like all 90,000 of us, need it to learn to understand what it means to site such a facility in a neighborhood. And again, I'm assuming that these are professionally run and supervised facilities. And I would hope that is sort of what makes the difference.
Absolutely. This facility will be fully staffed, not just a requirement of our own code, but of the state of Washington's. There's a rigorous licensing requirements for Northwest Youth Services to be operating a shelter for minors. These are 13-year-olds to 17-year-olds. So it will be staffed 24/7. And they always have a backup on site too. So 2 people that are adults on site. I can definitely provide a list of the non-confidential shelters that are out there in our community to you. And I'll talk to Sammy about how we can make that more, at least on our website, a little more accessible to get that information.
I think the only thing that I would add to that is that when we were adopting these rules or going forward with the process, we had substantial involvement with the providers. And it was actually, we started out this process trying to create a simple code that dealt with encampments and these larger facilities and even smaller facilities. And as you may recall, there were 2 separate rules and code sections that were adopted, one dealing with these temporary encampments and shelters, and then one dealing with these long-term interim uses. And during that process, I was actually very surprised. I work in the department, and I was surprised at how many of these facilities are located throughout our neighborhoods already. And we've never received calls or complaints about them. So a lot of thought went into how we adopted the rules and regulations and what they covered. And there was a lot of participation by the providers in making sure that we got the rules right.
Thank you. Councilmember Hamel.
Yeah, just to answer Councilmember Lilliquist's question, I served on DV Staff's board for a number of years, and we operate 2 shelters, one in Birchwood and one is and I'm not going to disclose the other. And then Sun Community Services operates a facility in the Seahome neighborhood. They operate Greggy's Place in my neighborhood in Seahome. And there are multiple reentry facilities, one in Happy Valley and another one on Seahome. These are fairly common throughout the community. I don't know if they have police contact or not. We really don't hear a lot about that, but they are distributed through the community.
Thank you, Councilmember Hamel. Any further discussion or questions on this item? Okay. Seeing none, thank you to Kurt and Tara for answering questions, and I'll turn it back to you, Mayor Fleetwood.
That's the end of the mayor's report. I just want to thank Tara and Kurt and James for answering questions on this tonight. So back to you, Council President.
Thank you very much. So this morning we started with Public Works and Natural Resources, and that committee is chaired by Councilmember Lilliquist. So I will turn it over to him for that report out.
Thank you, Hannah. So the committee today had only one item, and it was an information-only briefing on the Lake Whatcom Total Maximum Daily Load, or TMDL, update. This was part 2, focusing primarily on monitoring and modeling. The city this morning provided a presentation to the City Council on the TMDL load, monitoring and modeling, and that's basically what it says in the agenda bill. Under the Clean Water Act, Lake Whatcom is considered impaired, and that therefore there's a need to restore it by reducing the polluted runoff. And to do that, they had to establish a maximum amount of pollutant loading that could go into the lake. And so that's the number we have. When that number was adopted, we used the data and the models that were available at the time. And so a lot of the presentation today had to do with all the data gathering efforts that have gone on in recent years, and also the changes into the models, not only models about how the pollutants can flow off of the land into the water, but models about what happens in the water once the pollutants get there. It may be that the maximum amount set by the TMDL should be a different number than the one that was adopted. And when all these numbers are run and they'll reach a determination of what the maximum would be now that should be allowed, given our improved understanding of the situation. If that amount is greater or less than about 10% of the current value, the city will have an option to request that the Department of Ecology sort of revise the TMDL target, and will plan based on the new target. It's too early to say whether or not the new target would be any different than the current one, or very much different at all. We'll be hearing about that in the future when those studies are finalized. And that is the end of the report.
Thank you, Councilmember Lilliquist. So next this afternoon, we had Committee of the Whole, and the full council was present, and we had a number of items before us this afternoon. The first of which was Agenda Bill 23116, the Opportunity Council presentation on local federal assistance. So the Opportunity Council presented the current and future federal assistance programs available locally, specifically tied to rental and utility assistance. So we were joined by Debbie Payton and Lorena Shaw from the Opportunity Council to discuss in some detail. I would encourage members of the public who are interested to go back and watch that presentation this afternoon. But looking at TRAP funding, which is tied to the eviction and rent assistance, as well as LEHEAP and LWHOP, which is for utility as well as water assistance. And so as we've been looking at, throughout the pandemic and people's struggles to stay current on just basic needs regarding rent, water, energy, and garbage collection as well, we're looking at approximately $14 million in funding going towards rental assistance and utility assistance, and wanting to make sure that members of the public knew a couple of key points. One is that the hope is that the funding that's been coming in is going to meet the need. I know that we're cautiously optimistic, just apprehensive about obviously what's to come when the eviction moratorium is lifted, and hopeful to be able to keep people in their homes. Second is that to confirm that the process for receiving assistance, especially related to rental assistance, but perhaps related to utilities as well, is that that assistance is paid directly to the landlord or the utility or service provider, and not provided to the tenant directly, but instead that goes to the landlord again, or the utility service provider. And finally, the needs assessment and eligibility is set as at 150% of the poverty guidelines, which for a family of 4, that's roughly a little over close to $40,000 a year, which works out to about $3,300 a month. But they have a system in place right now through the Opportunity Council, where now it's weekly on Mondays starting at 8 a.m. There's a pre-application available online that you can access through the Opportunity Council website. If you are in a situation where you are in need of assistance and would like to confirm whether or not you're eligible. So we would encourage members of the public who are in need of those services to follow up with the Opportunity Council. Councilmember Lillquist.
Thank you. I think the thing that I found really useful is the information that you don't have to have lost your income for the entire year to become income eligible. There are ways of becoming eligible if you simply say lost your job or fell behind your rent for a period of 3 months or 6 months or some other number. They will do some averaging across. So if you've got yourself back on your feet but still have debt, you may still be eligible. So if you were in those situations, still consider calling.
Absolutely. Thank you, Councilmember Lillquist, especially because of just the uncertainty that members of the community have experienced over the last 18 months or so. Every situation is going to be different, but the short answer is that if you're in need, to certainly reach out to find out if there's assistance available. The second item before us during Committee of the Whole was Agenda Bill 23003. This was with respect to the American Rescue Plan Act update. So the administration presented proposed strategies for community-wide investment of the American Rescue Plan Act funding, a component of the federal government's overall relief plan to mitigate the negative impacts of the COVID-19 pandemic. Staff presented strategies to program the $21 million allocated to the city of Bellingham to address housing and homelessness, economic recovery, and climate resiliency efforts. And so that presentation came before us this afternoon. Mayor Fleetwood spoke, as well as Tara Sundin with Planning and Community Development. I wanted to highlight that just the people first guiding principles that have continued to guide the disbursement of these funds, specifically tied to the American Rescue Plan Act, but wanting to make sure that the needs of people in our community are at the forefront of the allocation of funds going forward. And so in the presentation, again, it's detailed presentation this afternoon. I would encourage members of the public to go back and watch that presentation. But there was a proposal related to basically buckets of priority areas or funding, coming down to 3 main areas. So one being housing and food security and homelessness, looking at approximately $10 million of that $21 million to be allocated specifically to that bucket. The second bucket being economic recovery, emphasis on tourism and childcare, that being approximately $6 million of the $21 million. And then the third bucket is climate resiliency and vulnerable populations and carbon reduction, and approximately $5 million to be allocated in that area. And so one of the things we're looking at specifically with climate resiliency is focusing on city buildings where vulnerable people can find respite. And we're looking at needs for electric cooling and ventilation systems to manage heat and smoke events, as we've seen most recently over the last couple of years. And then also to try and support and also implement requirements for electrification when funding the construction of new affordable housing in projects like the Laurel Forest project and Millworks down at the waterfront. And so these funds need to be spent within 3 years. So contracts would need to be in place by the end of 2024 going forward. And so this afternoon, there were staff recommendations that were one, to approve the priority areas and funding buckets subject to change as circumstances change. So leaving some flexibility in there, as well as approving iterative approval process. And so one of the pieces of the proposed approval process is looking at how the approval of those funds and disbursement would move from sort of this high-level imagining of the buckets through contracts and ultimate implementation and disbursement of those funds. And so this afternoon, there was a unanimous motion to approve the priority and funding buckets as well as the iterative approval process, and I so move.
Okay.
Motion's been made by the chair and a second by Councilmember Knudsen. Further discussion or comments from council on that presentation? Okay, seeing none, all in favor will say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Any opposed or abstentions? Seeing none, that passes 7-0. So the next item before Committee of the Whole this afternoon was Agenda Bill 22972. This is an update on process to create a county-wide racial equity commission. So racial justice protests following the murder of George Floyd in 2020 catalyzed conversations across the nation on how to confront systemic racism. Local community members advocated for the creation of a racial equity commission to bring people together to address racism and reduce disparities across Whatcom County. The City of Bellingham and Whatcom County are funding, participating in, and supporting a community-led process in partnership with the Chuckanut Health Foundation to create recommendations for a county-wide racial equity commission. Representatives from the Chuckanut Health Foundation reported on the progress of this work. And so this afternoon, we were joined by Heather Flaherty, as well as Shuling Zhao and Christina Michelle Martins to speak to the work of the Racial Equity Commission. And I would encourage members of the public to, again, to go back and watch that presentation and to just appreciate and absorb the amount of work that's gone into really laying a really strong foundation for the work that's going to come forward from this project. And basically, they were one of the things they highlighted was the sort of call to them through that RCP or RFP was to work to identify sources of racial inequity and then advise county and city governments on strategies for addressing these inequities. And so the group has worked hard to basically develop the foundation, again, with stakeholders that represent broad racial diversity as well as geographical representation and skills and sectors. And one of the things that they highlighted was the vision statement that the group has come up with, that these stakeholders have come up with, and that wording has been very important and that every word has been chosen very deliberately and carefully. And so the vision statement, which is what do we hope for our neighbors, reads as follows. It says, people of all races in Whatcom County live, thrive, and belong for who they are, as they are, without fear, every day. And so the work of the Racial Equity Commission will continue. And in the work, I think it was also important to carry on the message that there's a difference between urgency and haste, right? And so wanting to move forward as quickly as possible because we know that the need is great and there's lots of work to be done, but the need to also be very mindful and deliberate in the work that's being done. So to recognize that urgency, but to also not be too hastily in the steps that we take to make sure that, again, that foundation is being built very strong so that as the work moves forward, it's done so broadly as a community together. I don't know if any other council members had anything else to share from that presentation this afternoon. But again, I would recommend that community members go back and watch that and express appreciation as well, again, for Christina Michelle Martins and Shuling Zhao and Heather Flaherty for coming and sharing time with us about just the steps that have been taken thus far. So the next item before us this afternoon was Agenda Bill 23117. This is a resolution affirming that racism is a public health crisis. Awareness of the persistence of racism in the United States grew rapidly in 2020 after the murder of George Floyd and resulting national protests. A number of governments and associations have passed resolutions or adopted statements affirming that racism is a public health crisis to clarify the pernicious impacts on health of persistent patterns of racial discrimination. City council members have worked with community members to produce the attached document in the packet, and the Whatcom County Board of Health passed a similar measure in November of 2020. So this afternoon, we again had heard from our own council member, Dan Hamill, as well as Shuling Zhao and Heather Flaherty regarding the resolution that was included in the packet, and really focusing on the duty of repair. So the hard work that has gone in and engagement with the community to craft this particular resolution has been immense and a huge lift. One is to recognize sort of the perils of the past. And so the whereas clauses really speaking to what's happened here within Whatcom County and our region and where we live, to really highlight the why this important work needs to go forward, and also calling into just the importance that sometimes, we'll hear comments from community members or others saying that you recognize that things may happen in other communities, but maybe not here, holding ourselves to be better, that we're striving higher, and hoping that, that doesn't happen in Bellingham, and that maybe racism isn't as much of a public health crisis to contend with. And so the whereas clauses were really critical to highlight the past and really the perils of the past in this region, and recognizing the impact of systemic racism in our community. And then really moving through that in this resolution, then therefore highlighting what are those action items and how is the city of Bellingham and the council and the administration and the community at large going to move forward with this duty of repair, and how do we take this resolution from words on a page into action, and not only recognizing racism as a public health crisis, but acknowledging the work to be done every day by all of us as we move forward. So the therefore section of the resolution, I think, is very important for members of the public as well to read, and because it's very deliberate, again, in the wording and highlighting of the different ways in which the city can take direct action in connection with this resolution. And so this afternoon, there was unanimous vote by the council to adopt the resolution as presented, and I so move.
Second.
So motion's been made by the chair and a second by Council Member Hamill. Any discussion or further comments from council? Okay, seeing none, all in favor will say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Any opposed or abstentions? Okay. Seeing none, that passes 7-0. So we have a set of minutes for consideration. This is from the September 13th, 2021 meeting.
Move approval.
Second.
Motion's been made by Councilmember Hamill and a second by Councilmember Huffman. Any discussion or corrections to those minutes?
I'll abstain. I wasn't there.
Thank you, Councilmember Knudsen. Any other correction? Any corrections? Okay. Seeing none, all in favor will say aye.
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 Any opposed? Any abstentions?
Aye.
Okay, so that passes 6-0 with Councilmember Knudsen abstaining. Okay, old and new business. Any items for old new business? Okay. I have a couple. One is, I just wanted to highlight briefly that our own BTV 10 received recognition and winning national awards for videos that had been produced. So there were actually 4 awards that BTV Bellingham received, and this was from the National Association of Telecommunications Officers and Advisors. And these were tied to videos from the library, one was highlighting Poetry Month in April. That won an award of distinction in the library category. The second was regarding library curbside service behind the scenes. And that video actually won 2 awards of honor in library and editing categories. And then the 4th video was featuring See Click Fix. And it was a promotional video that won an award of honor in this public service announcement category. And so I just wanted to take a moment to extend appreciation for all the hard work of our BTV crew. I wanted to mention that Ben Sklark and Scuttlelark and Ellie England and their work on the beat, bringing those videos forward, and also to the different departments. I know it's a broader lift than just Ben and Ellie together, but the work that's being done there, and appreciation for that. And the second item was just a follow-up to public comment session. So our first public comment session was held last Monday, the 20th, and I was joined by council members Lilliquist and Huffman. And I'm going to make, I guess, a change to the agenda just to have a formal report out at each council meeting about public comment. And so the meeting's minutes are available from that session online. So on the city website, where our city council meetings are listed, there are meeting minutes tied to that public comment session. Just going to let members of the public know there were a minimum of 46 people in attendance. It's hard to know for sure because people drop off and attend, and sometimes there's more than one individual attending from a particular portal or as an attendee. But so a minimum of 46 people in attendance, total of 21 attendees spoke to the council members. And the topics of discussion varied somewhat, but focused on vaccinations, both in support and opposition, as well as concerns surrounding housing and homelessness. But there's a brief synopsis of the topics that were covered by speakers, as well as those speakers' names listed. I also wanted to highlight and just extend appreciation to members of the public for participating in the public comment session. As well as this evening, we had a number of public hearings, and acknowledging that some people sign up to speak during the actual public hearing, but that we also receive written comments, some of which is included hearing testimony in our packets, or that we receive by email or through Engage Bellingham on a variety of topics, or sometimes on specific topics related to public hearings. But just wanting to express appreciation to members of the public who are staying engaged in that process and sharing your comments with the council in a variety of different venues. So thank you for that. And we will look forward to continued meetings and outreach and opportunities for further engagement. Any other items for old and new business? Okay. Seeing none, we had executive session this afternoon, and there were 2 items before us. Okay, so the first is labor relations. So this was a bargaining strategy. Staff provided information on a labor relations matter. This was for information and discussion only, and no action was taken. The second item was litigation. This is Lev versus City of Bellingham. Special counsel provided information on a litigation matter. The action item coming out of today's executive session is as follows. I'll entertain a motion to ratify and confirm the mediated settlement between the City of Bellingham and Judge Deborah Lev, and to authorize the mayor and the city's legal counsel to execute all necessary documents and to take such action to implement the settlement, and for other appropriate city officials to take such further action as may be necessary or desirable to effectuate the provisions of this motion and the settlement.
Move approval.
Second.
Motion's been made by Councilmember Knudsen and a second by Councilmember Hamel. Any discussion? Seeing none, all in favor will say aye.
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 Any opposed or abstentions? Seeing none, that passes 7-0. In addition, I wanted to make sure that the public knew that there will be a joint statement from Mayor Seth Fleetwood and Municipal Court Judge Deborah Lev, along with the settlement agreement. So a copy of the settlement agreement that will be posted tonight following this vote. It'll be posted online at www.cob.org/court, as well as on the city website at www.cob.org/mayor. And so obviously those couldn't be formally presented until final adoption by the council. But again, that joint statement and a copy of the settlement agreement will be available online shortly. Our next item, we have consent agenda.
Approve.
Second.
Motion's been made by Councilmember Knudsen and a second by Councilmember Hamel. Any discussion or changes? Seeing none, all in favor will say aye.
Aye. Aye.
Any opposed or abstentions? Seeing none, that passes 7-0. Final consideration of ordinances.
Move third and final.
Hold on one second.
That's quick.
The silence, it killed me.
Agenda Bill 23092, an ordinance of the City of Bellingham, Washington, accepting the donation of real property and improvements known as the Hillside Estates Stormwater Facility.
Move third and final.
Second.
Motion's been made by Councilmember Huffman and a second by Councilmember Knudsen. Any discussion from council? Seeing none, roll call, please.
Dan Hamel,
Aye.
Holly Huffman,
Aye.
Gene Knudsen,
Aye.
Michael Lillquist,
Aye.
Hannah Stone,
Aye.
Pinky Vargas,
Aye.
Lisa Anderson.
Aye.
Ordinance passes 7-0.
Thank you very much, Deputy Clerk Oaks. Anything further before the council? Okay, there's nothing further this evening. I was just going to remind members of the public that the next public comment session will be next Monday, October 4th at 7:00 p.m. And then our next council meeting will be the following Monday, October 11th, again at 7:00 p.m. So there's nothing further before the council this evening. Thank you very much, and we are adjourned.